recent legislation that has allowed the changes in the laws when it comes to the juvenile offender or juvenile offender at the time of their crime that are now half of them middle-aged and in our criminal justice system, there's the safety of them having to pass a parole board interview, having an agency that is trained, a group of people that are trained, that are using risk assessments, that are making those decisions based on the totality of a life and not on one incident, should make anybody in the public less fearful about those laws. I don't think any of these laws have been made so that we can empty out a prison. I don't think that has ever come across anybody's mind. What's come across is the fact that we need to look at this population differently because they are different. The 14-year-old and the 45-year-old are not the same person. People are always afraid. There's a lot of folks that have a very hard line that you go to prison and you stay to prison and you never come out. Well, that's not reality. Anywhere from 94 to 97% of all incarcerated folks are going to get out of prison sometime or another. So you have to make the decision, if it's going to come via parole, when is the best time to do that?
My name is Dr. Antoinette Kavanaugh. I'm a forensic clinical psychologist, which means that I have my PhD in clinical psychology. I've completed a postdoc in forensic psychology. I am also board certified in forensic psychology, and I've been doing this since about 1998. The body of research that talks about the normative development of the adolescent brain is well established. It's been funded by different arms of the federal government. It's been peer reviewed extensively and published extensively in publications in the United States as well as other countries. So I think it's a firmly established body of research that's also been accepted by our Supreme Court. But I like to think of it as, now we have the science to support what our grandmothers always knew. That is that adolescents are different and they will grow out of their differences. And these differences are normative. You should expect them. We all go through them.
I mean, I have children of my own, and I know that certainly my son's brain didn't start to work until he was about 25 or 26.
I have a 16-year-old grandson, and I watch the kind of things he does and says. You know, he's got so long to go before he grows up. But of course, who knows more than a 16-year-old kid, a 17-year-old kid? You know I knew everything. It's only been, in my 40s and 50s that I began to realize completely how little I knew.
The Supreme Court, based on social science literature, has accepted the fact that youth are immature. That this is not a state that marks one for life, but it is a state that marks youth and adolescence.
I think the U.S. Supreme Court had it right in the Miller and Montgomery decisions when they speak of the juvenile's capacity for change and the propensity of juveniles to reform.
These two young men that took my son's life, I was now sitting across the table from them, and they were able to explain their 15-year-old self.
What we know is that those stupid things don't define who we are as adults. And if we can remember, so as you're working with adolescents, to remember the stupid things you did and how you grew to become a productive citizen, that's what the literature shows that we should expect.
I am from a small town in south central Louisiana called Eunice. I'm fortunate that I had a lot of love from both my mother and my father. Growing up, I was a good student. I was in the gifted program, and I was very ambitious, and it looked like I had a lot of opportunities ahead of me in life.
I grew up in a very chaotic environment. My mother was an individual who suffered from borderline personality disorder, so the household itself was explosive, and it was like random acts of violence at any given time. So it was a very unsafe environment for myself and my older sibling. My only outlet of safety was the school. which was right across the street. And the school was an outlet for me to just really explore what it is that my little dreams were for a young person.
I grew up in rural Missouri, southwest Missouri, a little town called Neosho. There was about 10,000 people, so it's a pretty quiet neighborhood. I never was into high school sports or anything like that, or school sports, period. Because I was always kind of the quiet kid, never really fit in kind of kid.
I grew up in a rural town, Olive Branch, Mississippi, which borders Memphis, Tennessee. So I spent a lot of time running the streets of Memphis. I was considered a pretty good student, but I became a gang member at a young age, at the age of 12. My home was a little bit chaotic. My dad was an alcoholic. My mom was a very loving lady, came from a loving family. I watched them fight a lot. They didn't know that I was seeing them fight, but I would hear the arguments and, walk through the house and kind of see them fight.
My family life was what I kind of refer to now was a non-nurturing atmosphere. I never really fit in. Got picked on. I was a small kid, so I was bullied a lot. So in school, I kind of acted out in the classroom, not against other kids. I wasn't violent against other kids, but I acted out against teachers and things of that nature.
It wasn't until 1987 that my mother had lost everything to drugs and we needed to move. And my mother and I moved to Rubidoux, which is in Riverside County and is known as like the armpit of Riverside County. It was infested with gangs and a very just oppressive little town.
Until the time I was 15 years old, never experimented with drugs or alcohol. But the summer between my sophomore and junior year, I began to experiment with things I never had, started hanging out with a different group of friends, and started drinking and doing drugs, and that was the beginning of a pretty swift downfall for me.
But I did have one friend. My best friend was my age. One day, his older brother took the horn off of my bicycle while I was up playing with my friend. Wouldn't give it back, how little kids act, so I was chasing him around trying to get it. And he was not relenting at all, and until I become frustrated. So I went home and told my dad. All I remember in that interaction was that my dad told me, my dad went to, I think, his bedroom, come out with a pistol and said, "Get in the car." And we proceeded to go up to the house, and my dad confronted this guy, and nothing violent happened. The guy gave the horn back, said, "Hey, I was just playing with him," but I feel like that was the beginning stamp on or imprint, on my being and on developing my morals and how to resolve conflict and that sort of thing.
I was 15 years old when I committed the crime that I committed, and that night I had did a drug that I had never done before, never done since. And I don't like to use that as a crutch. I take full responsibility for my crime, but I also am fairly convicted that I would have not committed the crime I committed had I not smoked that drug. And it was marijuana laced with PCP.
While I was going to school, I discovered that I enjoyed writing and participating in politics, because I ran for student body president and actually won, right? So that was super exciting. And so I thought, this is going to be my way out of my environment, but still having to deal with the chaos that was going on inside of my home. And that itself was very troubling, because there was this fear that was building up inside of me as I would approach my home from school.
I really had a sense from my dad just growing up. I guess the morals that he instilled in me was the eye for an eye mentality. I wasn't really feeling love at home, and at some point I realized that I would receive what I felt was love, or I felt was a place of belonging with others outside of my house. And one day, this is actually when I was 16 years old, I was in my sister's apartment, and her roommate come home. Long story short, basically announced that she had been raped by this 34-year-old man that was under the guise of offering her a job interview, and then end up drugging her and raping her instead. Coming from that eye for an eye mentality, ultimately we decided Sunday night to go out to the man's house and beat him up.
As I got closer to my home, this apprehensiveness, this tightness in my body, and I felt like I needed to prepare and brace myself for whatever was to meet me once I opened the door. And whether it was going to be a mother who had festered in her own mental illness that day, or was she going to be isolated and hidden away in her room, which required me to, take on adult roles, which I was placed in a very early age, but yet I didn't understand what was going on. I just knew that going home was not a safe environment for me.
My older friends who sold drugs liked the fact that I was smart, and I knew a little bit about science, so I told them how to double their cocaine based on being able to use the jars in the science lab. I never was arrested prior to the offense that led me to prison. Never in the back of a police car, never questioned by police, never stopped and searched and frisked by police. I never had any interaction with the police or the criminal justice system prior to being convicted of the crime that led me to prison.
So by 10 and by the age of 11, right, I'd been in this environment for 2 years. By the age of 11, my trafficker had already introduced himself into my life. So that started at 11. And then from there, everything just started to go downhill.
For those people who argue they know right from wrong, I would say science has taught us it's not that simple. It's really contextually driven. A person who's trying to lose weight, like me, I'm always trying to lose weight, I know that I shouldn't eat cookies. But if I've had a really bad day, I might go home and eat them. Okay, so my emotions are involved, and that creates an arena for one to make poor decisions. Adolescence, that's magnified with adolescence. So when you, an adult, talk to an adolescent when they're not emotionally aroused and one-on-one, you get a response that reflects knowing right from wrong. However, get them in an emotionally charged situation or get them with their peers, that system that allowed them to quote-unquote know right from wrong, that system gets overtaken. The risk and reward system of the brain overrides that. So therefore, they're not able to demonstrate their ability. So it's not you always know it. I mean, we all know that we should work out multiple times a week, but then our life gets busy and we stop doing it, right? That's why gyms can make so much money. So there are things that in under one circumstance, and you may not be able to demonstrate that knowledge in another circumstance. And with adolescence, the circumstances that are going to make it more likely that you will not demonstrate your knowledge of right and wrong are when your friends are around and when you're emotionally aroused. Certainly trauma can impact brain development such that if you've had many traumatic events, those kinds of things will impact your brain development and the changes such that you're probably going to be behind the average adolescent who is far behind an adult. We know that a large percentage of the people who are involved in the justice system have experienced things in their lives that make it so that they are not where they should be in terms of this normative development, but they could catch up. So therefore, what negative impact their trauma or substance use or mental health issues had on the brain, once those things are addressed, then the brain is resilient, and that can allow them to get sort of on course as you would expect a person to do.
Being in the adult system as a kid, I was sent to the county jail. And for some reason, they didn't know that I was still 17, so they put me in adult population, which was the fourth floor in the Shelby County Jail, which was extremely violent. I was afraid, I really was, because I would hear rape stories that went on the fourth floor. And, at 17, I was a little guy. I was a little scrawny guy. and I really didn't think I would last.
Basically, I was in survival mode early on, and I just let myself fit in with what was going to protect me. I had to start fighting again because people there didn't know me. They just saw this young white guy, skinny, come in and had all these, ideas of how they could victimize me and use me and whatever.
Compassion. That's how we heal. Constantly inflicting punitive and you're bad and you're this and you're that, that's just inflicting more trauma. And it's like robbing someone of their water for life.
It's a very violent environment, and not just physical violence, but emotional violence. And it's a very aggressive atmosphere. It's very difficult to navigate through a environment that's can be physically violent, sexually violent. Especially being a young person, you're a target at all times. You're seen as weak. You're seen as a potential victim, and you're surrounded by sharks.
Most adolescents will outgrow their delinquent or antisocial or criminal behavior as they mature because their cognitive control system will become stronger, for lack of a better word, and the prevailing system. So it's only the minority of people who will continue to engage in antisocial behavior. So if the person before you is 40, 45, look at their behavior in the past 10, 15 years. If we haven't had any violent write-ups, if we haven't had behaviors that rise to the level of those that got them in, the absence of those things, I believe, point to how they've matured and point to the fact that that behavior that they demonstrated as an adolescent is not indicative of some character trait that they possess.
Early years were my most difficult years because still trying to fit in, still trying to figure out what group I want to be in. You're caught between wanting to be respected by your peers and you're wanting to be respected by the staff, administration, because you recognize, well, somehow they hold the key to maybe me getting out, me having this good quality of life. But the prison culture is, if you try to do well by administration standards, you alienate your fellow offenders. And that's, I think, especially hard on a juvenile, on a young person in prison, because they want that acceptance.
A large percentage of the people who are involved in the justice system have experienced things in their lives that make it so that they are not where they should be in terms of this normative development, but they could catch up. It could often be that the years that they've spent in prison have allowed them to catch up and mature.
Anybody who goes through being dehumanized, re-traumatized, oppressed, treated less than a third-class citizen, constantly labeled, and having to carry shame every day and to rise above that, I think is amazing, and especially for youthful offenders.
Jail and prison essentially became a university for me because all the older guys would give me books and encourage me to read. It was a lonely place, but I found a lot of consolace in studying and reading. So again, I turned prison into my university.
But ultimately, that put me in touch with the people that would help change my life. A counselor that run programming in that housing unit ended up ultimately becoming my mentor. We were tired of living this lifestyle that we were living, being thugs in prison. We didn't want to have to keep that persona up and keep fighting that. So we were trying to change ourselves, change our mentality.
For several years, I had no meaningful expectation that I would ever be released. But I always had hope that something would happen one day and I would have an opportunity for release. So that's what always motivated me to have the best quality of life while I was incarcerated and try to rehabilitate myself and identify the areas in my life that I needed work.
So the reactive teenager, I think for me, it took me a little bit, well, it was like the age of 25, 26 that I found myself not reacting to like this being frustrated or, you know, something like that. I took a little bit more time thinking about the consequences more so, where before consequences weren't really at the forefront of my mind. And then I was just like, I'm angry, I'm hurt, you hurt me, and who cares? And it's, you know, it was a whole different level. And then I just found myself like having more patience and clarity. And I think that whatever seeds were planted, you know, in my early 20s and things like that began to finally blossom.
I think the person who says, this happened because I was young, that statement in and of itself reflects a level of maturity. They can recognize how they thought then and how different it is now.
You know, I look back and I think to myself that 15-year-old had no clue, you know, when he told himself, I want to start hanging out with different guys, I'm missing out on fun, I want to do these drugs, I want to see what it feels like. You know, he had no idea of the repercussions that would come with it.
In my childish mind, it was just gonna be a fun event, something that we can laugh about, a couple of bucks that we can buy some candy and chips with, and, you know, just back on the block chilling. You know, that was my thought process.
So many individuals who we see as perpetrators, you know, they themselves have been victimized. And usually the outcome of the crime is a result of the victimization that is not healed or given an outlet to heal.
As that kid, I felt like what I did was justified. Like I said, my dad had taught me the eye for an eye mentality. So the idea of going to the police, talking to the police about it, reporting it, never really even came to mind.
Youth are a reflection of the adults that are in their lives. So the accountability, I think, should not just be placed on a youth, right? That's a lot. When there's other factors that need to be taken into account as to how did that individual get to this place.
If they felt that the argument that a person may make of I was young and impulsive was an excuse, now they should be able to rely upon science to help them understand that person is not offering an excuse, but is instead offering something that science has demonstrated is a normative characteristic of being young.
My name is Charlotta Evans, and December 21st, 1995, I lost my 3-year-old son, Kason Xavier Evans, to a drive-by shooting. 21 bullets fired, 14 to the car, 7 to the house, that we were there picking up a relative. And in that process, my 2 sons were in the back seat of the car, and so I lost my 3-year-old son, Kason Xavier Evans, nicknamed Biscuit.
My name is Linda White. I live near Houston, Texas. My daughter was killed by 2 juveniles. Kathy was 26 at the time that she was killed. And I went to a victims group for support, found them to be really helpful for a time. But I also noticed that no one ever moved. No one was encouraged to move. No one was encouraged to heal.
You know, the loss, most severe pain anyone could experience is the loss of a child, and especially in that fashion of violence.
I think they felt that it empowered them, and I can understand that. That nothing more powerful than righteous indignation, and we certainly, having lost our kids to violence, had every right to be angry and righteous. But my husband and I had been devastated by it, and we were too busy trying to take care of our daughter's 5-year-old daughter. And Amy needed us, and she didn't need us to be full of anger all the time. And that isn't what I wanted to go forward in my life with. I wanted us to heal.
My job, I do healing dialogues for individuals who have been victimized by a youthful perpetrator or offender. And I also work with those who have committed these crimes. It's remarkable to see, as well as feel, the human capacity that each of us has when we have these conversations.
4 years ago, I had that dialogue with the main shooter. And then 2 months ago, I had the dialogue with the second shooter. I was able to sit across the table of two grown men, and that had done their own self-care, that had rehabilitated themselves, that were remorseful, accountable. And witnessing that gave me the hopes that change can happen.
I began to look for something. I didn't know if there was even anything out there, but I just felt like there was enough pain and suffering in the world. We didn't need to try to have more. And I was looking for something that could elevate all of us. Have the offenders be accountable, but we didn't have to become angry, vengeful people for that to happen. And I found restorative justice quite by accident. I found it through my church, actually. And it has been a big mover and shaker for me ever since.
We cannot couple all victim families in one basket. We have an individuality. We all do not stress revenge, hate, and retaliation and bitterness. And that there is some of us victim families that really do have a heart of compassion.
There's a whole host of studies that show that when an adolescent thinks they're being observed by their peer, they make riskier decisions and they have poorer outcomes. So these studies, the person will be in the fMRI machine and they're playing this video game, and you've got to get from one point to the other really quickly, okay? And then they have you do it when you believe you're alone, and then and then you go through it, and they say, we're going to go through it again. And your friend who I've asked you to bring is in a different room. And now your friend speaks in the intercom and just says something like, hey, Johnny. And unbeknownst to you, the friend leaves. But you, because the friend has said something, you think you're being watched. And they do this where they'll have adolescents and adults do it with friends and without. And what we see is that you make riskier choices when you think your friend is watching when you're an adolescent than when you do when you're an adult. It's very nuanced and very powerful. So it's about the belief that your friends are there or simply having your friends there. So a group of kids, by virtue of being in a group, they will make poorer decisions than they would alone. Now, when you ask the adult or the adolescent who was going through this, do you think your behavior changed after your friend said hello? They'll respond no. So they believe they're responding the same way. So they really don't understand how they're making riskier choices. Insurance companies they haven't known the science behind it, but they've known the behavior behind it. In many jurisdictions, a young person who's gotten their license or learner's permit can't be in the car with another young person. Do you see? And that's because the behavior changed. So I doubt insurance companies knew the science behind it, but they certainly knew the outcome and the cost to them. The adolescent brain is wired, and this is normative, such that their peers have a greater influence on them, and that results in riskier decisions. So therefore, it's no surprise that many adolescents commit crimes and delinquent activities when they're with their peers to a degree that's greater than you would expect of an adult.
at the time of them being 15, there was no explanation. And that's due to brain development.
I think the professionals that work in corrections go into the field because they think they can make a difference, because they believe in redemption. They believe that people can change.
Our system, at least in theory, is based on rehabilitation. That's why we call them penitentiaries. You know, that we assume that if you invest in someone, that they can be rehabilitated. And when that's the model, then the only way that's going to work is if we do actually let them go when we have reasonable assurance that they have been rehabilitated.
After 10 and a half years, I had no thought of any crime. I mean, my heart had changed. Spiritually, I was a different person.
If we can't believe in the rehabilitation and the support of juveniles being able to change their lives, why are we in this field?
But what we know is that those stupid things don't define who we are as adults. And if we can remember, so as you're working with adolescents, to remember the stupid things you did and how you grew to become a productive citizen, that's what the literature shows that we should expect.
Somebody that committed a crime at 14 or 15 years old will be a very different person than the 35 or 40-year-old that's sitting in front of you. And I think it's a mistake to base all decisions on what the actual event was that 20 or 30 years ago.
It doesn't make sense to fill our prisons with people who have the capacity to change and have demonstrated that they can change and demonstrate that they can go out in the community and be good citizens.
I want you to keep in mind that we know developmentally where a person is when they're an adolescent is not where they'll be when they grow up. There's a big difference, and it's called maturity. I want you to keep in mind that there are studies to show that when you put a person who's under 18 in a penitentiary, they will act out for the first couple of years. That's what we should expect. So therefore, keep in mind, I want you to look at how their disciplinary records have changed over time. That change can be an indicator of maturity.
I've been to quite a few parole hearings, given my background, as a prosecutor, and then given the work that I'm doing now. And often, the seriousness of the offense will be the factor that preponderates against release. Now, there may be a whole host of factors that weigh in favor of release. But the parole board, when it's a murder case, something really tragic and terrible, they'll fall back on the seriousness of the offense and deny release. And even speaking as a former prosecutor, I think that is a really bad idea, because the seriousness of the offense, number one, has already been taken into account based on what the conviction was and the sentence that was imposed. If it's a murder case, you're not going to be up for release after 6 months. We take that into account when we write our criminal law and when we impose our sentences. So it's already been considered. But number two, that's the one factor that never changes. That's the one constant that the person serving the sentence can do nothing about, even after 20 years. And so I don't think it's fair, I don't think it's just for a parole board to hang its hat on the seriousness of the offense when it's deciding whether or not to grant a second chance.
If they felt that the argument that a person may make of "I was young and impulsive" was an excuse, now they should be able to rely upon science to help them understand that person is not offering an excuse, but is instead offering something that science has demonstrated is a normative characteristic of being young. Some of the risk instruments for recidivism will penalize this person because they didn't have the opportunity to do things that would have lowered their score, like get married. If you've been in since you were 18 or younger, you had no opportunity to get married. You're going to be penalized for that. So I want you to understand that the nature of some of the instruments that will typically be used with adults in the system are not relevant and are not reliable when used with this population.
victims are as different as a group of people as they were before the crime happened. And I think that not having something that might be restorative at some point and less vindictive, I think it continues to do harm.
I've heard this statement over and over again: hurt people hurt people. And it's not until you're able to talk about that hurt openly and not be judged for your own personal hurt that you're actually able to begin healing. A lot of guys sitting behind prison walls who have hurt people are dying to talk to someone about their own level of hurt. You know, being able to hear a person's personal life, even if they're not granted parole, that person goes back to the compound with a relief off of their back, saying somebody has finally heard something that I can't tell other men around me.
As that 16-year-old and throughout my adolescence, that I didn't have control of the outside forces that were shaping me. I feel like as children we're victims of our own circumstance. We don't control the environment that we are raised in. We don't control the things that we see. We don't control the messages that we are getting from our parents, from our peers, that are forming our opinions and our morals.
I want to tell you there are great people who are in prison, and they do great things, and people would be surprised a lot of the positive things that go on in prison and the positive individuals who are making these things happen.
When we put you in a prison, it's just to punish you. Punish, punish, punish for as long as possible. And when we can see now that we're a ways into the era of mass incarceration, just how wrong-headed that is. The only thing that does any good is to invest in people while they're serving their time, and then when we have reasonable assurance that there's been rehabilitation, to let them go so they can stop being a burden on the taxpayers, so they can live their lives and contribute to society, because we know now, we have the science to know that children, whether you're talking about a 13-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 17-year-old, really all the way up until you're 25 or so, so we want to take a look and say, well, you know, this is not the same person that committed this crime. You know, a 16-year-old committed this crime who didn't fully have the capacity for impulse control and appreciating the consequences of their conduct. And now we're dealing with somebody who has grown and matured. We're dealing with a man as opposed to a boy. And so we have to take into account the peculiar nature of child offenders and the unique ability that they have to make positive changes in their life.